We don't want that. One way to minimize it is to add nitrogen gas. And the reason nitrogen gas works is that it's much less soluble than carbon dioxide, and it's not able to go from bubble to bubble. The amount of nitrogen you use is much less than the amount of carbon dioxide, but it really does work. My personal experience is that most beers have got sufficient foam-positive material. When I was a quality control manager for a period of time in the north of England, I was often called out to bars and pubs and clubs because there were complaints about the foam. And invariably it was nothing to do with the beer as it left the brewery. It was everything to do with the beer as it was being treated in the pub. And in particular, it was to do with the cleanliness of the glass. Many of you will be familiar with washing up. Some of you may not be, but some of you will be. And when you wash up, you put detergent into the water, and of course you get rather a nice foam. So detergent actually will give you a stable foam. Soaps will give you a stable foam. That's because they have a hydrophilic part, but a hydrophobic part as well, which interacts to stabilize the bubbles. So you can have foams based on detergents and fats. And we've already talked about foams that are stabilized by proteins and bitter acids. If you have both mixed together, then the proteins can no longer interact because the detergents or the fats get in the way. And the fats and detergents can't interact because the proteins get in the way. So if you have a beer and it encounters detergent or fat, then the foam will collapse. And my personal experience is this is the most frequent occurrence of foam problems. Try it for yourself. Take a couple of glasses, 2 glasses, put one into the soapy dishwater, wash it, dry it on a dirty old cloth, and put it to one side. The other one, wash it in the same water, now rinse it in clean water, dry it by inverting it and letting it dry naturally. And then use both glasses, pour in the same beer to both glasses, and you'll find that the one that was allowed to drain and had been rinsed in clean water will give a much better foam. Here's another one. Eat a burger, particularly if you've got a mustache. Great globules of grease and filth will drip off the mustache into the beer and kill the foam. If you don't have a mustache, then apply some lipstick. If you do have a mustache, apply the lipstick too. And you'll see that the foam will not be quite so good. So here, the moral of that story is eliminate the mustache, do not wear lipstick if you want a good foam on your beer. So foam has many manifestations to it. What I do know is it's extremely important for beer quality, but it can go too far, and that would be gushing. When you take off the top of the beer bottle, take off the crown cork, and the beer zooms out of the bottle. And the reason it does that is because there are nucleation sites in the beer. I said earlier that to get a foam, you need to have nucleation. And if you don't have nucleation taking place, the carbon dioxide will not spontaneously come out of the beer. With gushing beer, you have nucleation sites in the product, and this causes a problem. When we talked about barley, I talked about fusarium, a microorganism which will contaminate the grain and produces a small protein called hydrophobin, which is very hydrophobic and forms a nucleation site for bubble release. And this is a major cause of endemic gushing whenever it occurs. It's a particular problem in grain that is grown in regions that are damp, giving a greater risk during the growth of the barley. But any particle that you will find in beer will cause a gushing risk I remember once I was in a country in Asia, and they clearly had not cleaned the glass properly, the bottles of glass, and there were slivers of glass left in the bottle, and these promoted gushing. There are a number of other causes, and of course, injudicious agitation of the beer is a problem. So for goodness sake, if you have dropped your can of beer, leave it a while before you pour it out. One of the causes of gushing then can be turbidity in the product. But we don't want turbidity in the product generally, unless it's a beer like a Hefeweizen, which is supposed to be cloudy. Most beers are supposed to be bright, and this is why we filter the beer, and why the beer is clarified before going into the final container. But over time, beer will go turbid, will go cloudy, and there are a number of causes for this. One of the causes is something called oxalic acid. Now, I don't know if you've ever eaten rhubarb, but if you've eaten rhubarb, your tongue goes kind of furry and coated. That is due to oxalic acid. There is oxalic acid in grain, and if it gets into the finished beer, it can form particles and bits in the beer, and these will form nucleation sites for gushing, but they will also be seen as bits in the beer. And that's a problem. The way to avoid oxalic acid is to precipitate it, to get rid of it in the brew house by adding calcium. And that is one of the reasons why the calcium level in the brew house is very important, because it binds to oxalic acid and out it comes, and it's lost with the spent grains and the trub. If the oxalic acid encounters calcium in the beer or in the beer line, then you have a problem. And so this oxalic acid reacting with calcium in your beer lines on draft dispense is a major problem, because the dispense line will block. It's called beer stone. That is due to calcium oxalate. But back to turbidity in beer. If you don't remove those cell wall components efficiently in the malting of barley, those polysaccharides in the cell wall can cause a problem with clarity. If you don't get rid of the starch, if you don't hydrolyze all of the starch, then it can cause a haze in the beer. If you get agitation in the beer, and lots of bouncing around on the back of ships going across the oceans, then that agitation can promote haze formation. When people talk about beer haze, the materials they particularly talk about are proteins and polyphenols, or tannins. The proteins come from the grain, not the same proteins that cause foaming or are responsible for foaming, different types of proteins. The polyphenols come from both the grain and from the hops. And these two will react together in the finished product to form this turbidity over a period of time, particularly if the beer is chilled. So what we try to do as brewers is eliminate these haze-forming proteins, eliminate the polyphenols without jeopardizing any other aspect of product quality. And the achievement, therefore, of beer stability is closely dependent on what we do throughout the process. For example, we can select our raw materials to minimize the level of some of these problematic materials. Several years ago, Carlsberg developed barleys that no longer contained these polyphenols which caused hazes. If you use hop preparations that are made with these liquid carbon dioxide and isomerization, they no longer contain polyphenols. The whole of the malting process is important for eliminating the cell wall polysaccharides. The brewery, in the brew house, by adding enough calcium, we eliminate oxalic acid. The vigorous rolling boil that I talked about earlier to actually precipitate out protein. The fermentation will remove some of these materials with the yeast head in fermentation. After fermentation, taking the beer down to the lowest possible temperature without freezing it will remove much of this material as a precipitate, and then you filter it away. And then we can remove the protein using silica hydrogels, and we can remove polyphenols with PVPP. Actually, you can add extra polyphenol in the form of something called tannic acid, which you get from gall nuts, and this will react with the protein and remove it. Or you can add an enzyme. There's an enzyme called papain. Papain comes from the leaf of papaya, pawpaw. And some people know that you can wrap meat in these leaves and the meat will tenderize. And that's because of this enzyme called papain. An organization called the Wallerstein Laboratories over 100 years ago showed that this enzyme will stabilize beer by chewing up the proteins that are responsible for haze. The problem is the proteins responsible for the foam are also chewed up by this enzyme. More recently, a new enzyme is marketed in the brewing industry, an enzyme which specifically will react with the haze proteins but will not react with the foaming proteins. But really it's the whole process from barley and wheat and hops right the way through the brewery to the finished product that has to be right if we are not going to get unwanted turbidity in our product. Of course, turbidity in the beer may also be due to the growth of microorganisms. Beer is not absolutely resistant to spoilage. It is relatively resistant. Not many microorganisms will grow in beer, and certainly no pathogens will grow in beer, which is really good news. Beer is relatively inhospitable to spoilage. Earlier on in the brewery, there is a greater risk. In the wort production, in the brew house, there is a risk from so-called wort spoilage organisms, organisms that rejoice in names like obesum bacterium. That bacterium is very capable of making DMS, the dimethyl sulfide I talked about in the context of lager flavor. It will produce too much DMS, really over the top levels of DMS. It's like having parsnip solution. Beer itself is more resistant for several reasons. Beer contains alcohol, so this inhibits the growth of many organisms. Beer also does not contain much residual material for organisms to grow on. For example, it contains very low levels of the amino acids that the bacteria would need. Beer also contains the bitter acids, and these are anti-lactic acid bacteria. They inhibit the growth of many, but not all, lactic acid bacteria, especially at lower pHs, especially under more acidic conditions. And the acidity itself, the pH 4 or 4.5, that also is detrimental to the growth of many, but not all, microorganisms. And of course, beer contains, in the package, very little oxygen. And this means that organisms requiring oxygen will not grow. It is a problem, however, with beer on tap. And once beer is on tap, draft beer is on tap, and there's an increased risk or an increased opportunity for air to creep in, now there is an increased risk of spoilage by the acetic acid bacteria, the organisms which will produce vinegar-like flavors. So we can't relax, we can't sit back and not worry about microorganisms, but for the most part it's not a major problem in the brewing industry. Brewers are very conscientious about making sure the whole brewery is clean and cleaned. And so the number of organisms that need to be removed either by sterile filtration or pasteurization is usually very low. And then, in the final container, the risks from microbial spoilage are minimal. So there are a great many aspects to beer quality. We've talked about foam, we've talked about the clarity and the colour, and we've talked about excessive gushing, we've talked about the minimal risks of spoilage, and of course we have discussed flavour and the changes in flavour which can take place in beer with time. Another element of product quality, of course, is its safety and wholesomeness. Can it do us any harm? And might it even do us some good? And that's what we will address in the next lecture.
This ends Lecture 11. Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 12. Beer, Healthfulness and Perception.
In this lecture we're going to look at the impact of beer and alcohol generally on health and well-being. You know, being a professor on a university campus, some people think I'm, being the beer guy, think I'm some sort of corrupting influence. I don't view it that way. I view my role as responsibly pointing out the important things about beer in terms of its technology, but also to sensibly show people the relative merits and demerits of this wonderful product. And we don't try to disguise anything. It was Saint Arnoldus who said, "From man's sweat and God's love, beer came into the world." And a maxim from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi was, "Know thyself and nothing to excess." As we found earlier, beer has been drunk for, well, probably more than 8,000 years. And for the greatest time then it's become a staple part of the diet in many cultures, or at least a staple part of social activity. Actually, much more besides. It's actually been used over the years as a mouthwash. It's been used as an applicant to wounds. It's even been used as an enema and as a douche, but I just recommend you drink it. In the Aztec nation, religious worshippers were obliged to get drunk for fear of displeasing the gods. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad forbade his followers to drink alcohol, thereby establishing a point of difference from Christianity. So the Quran speaks of alcohol as being an abomination and the work of Satan. So, lots of different opinions. The Turiki of Kenya, the tribe there, for them, beer is a medium of social interchange, actually for men. Drinking beer together inducing physical and social mellowness. With very little aggressive behavior, and pathological addiction very rarely occurs. So when people talk about the fact that, you know, just to take one sip of a product like beer is a downhill slope and the first stage towards damnation, there is a considerable amount of evidence to the contrary. In the Middle Ages in England and Flanders, Bavaria, Bohemia, those sorts of places, ale or beer was a key to the diet alongside meat, bread, milk and vegetables. You would be thought pretty strange if you questioned ale's legitimate place on the table. It wasn't a comfort food, it wasn't an extravagance, it was simply a fact of day-to-day life. In 8th century England, a monk might consume 8 pints of ale a day, and that didn't make them into raging hooligans. They quietly prayed. Bunker in 1947, immediately after the last World War, pointed out that beer, in those post-war days, quite modest in its alcohol content, just 3% alcohol by volume, beer provided 200 calories and a fifth of a working man's requirement for calcium, phosphorus, nicotinic acid and riboflavin. So much for empty calories. Indeed, the Brewer's Journal in 1939 reported this on the basis of a study by the Royal Society. The Royal Society in London is the equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences. So The Brewer's Journal claimed this study: a barrel of beer is the equivalent in cumulative nutritive value of 10 pounds of beef ribs, 8 pounds of shoulder mutton, 4 pounds of cheese, 20 pounds of potatoes, 1 pound of rump steak, 3 pounds of rabbit, 3 pounds of plaice, a fish, 8 pounds of bread, 3 pounds of butter, 6 pounds of chicken, and 19 eggs. Now that is not empty calories, that's a meal in itself. I remember once giving a talk and a famous medic came rushing up to me afterwards and said, "Is it true, therefore, that if we could only boost the level of vitamin B1 in beer, it would be a perfectly well-balanced diet?" And I said, even I wouldn't say that. At least you need a few pretzels. But I am joking. But taken wisely and temperately, then, in the opinion of me and a number of others, beer is a worthy component of society. The vast majority of people who take a beer are not drunken drivers, they're not wife-beaters, football hooligans, panhandlers, or indeed alcoholics. And they're not going to go on to become those things. But it is all about moderation. The Chinese Shu Qing from about 650 before the current era said, "Men will not do without Q, which is a beer made from millet or rice. To prohibit it and secure total abstinence from it is beyond the power even of sages," they said. "Here, therefore, we have warnings on the abuse of it." And the Mongolian chief Genghis Khan said, "A soldier must not get drunk oftener than once a week. It would, of course, be better if he didn't get drunk at all, but one should not expect the impossible." Now, I am certainly not advocating excessive drinking, but it's really obvious that over many years, there has been a focus on moderation, and so it should continue. But it was Lord Darmanin, who was an advisor to the British Prime Minister Lloyd George in the early part of the 20th century, who said alcohol is an ungrateful subject. Most people who are interested in it are already partisans on one side or the other, and no body of impartial opinion exists which is ready to be guided by scientific inquiry. The majority of those who would give any attention to original work on the subject would do so less to gain knowledge than to find arms and argument to support their preconceived opinion. What I strive to do in my role is to present a balanced opinion. Clearly, in the position I'm in, people will claim that I am biased towards beer. The reality is I really genuinely am trying to point out both sides of the argument and try to reach the middle ground. I use the word moderation a lot. I was interviewed in a newspaper some while ago and they drew attention to the number of times I used the word moderation. And it's a very difficult thing to define. And as I think we've talked about before, what is moderation for a Czech man working in industry is probably going to be somewhat different to a person working in a somewhat less prolific beer drinking country. So moderation is very difficult to define. Later on we will talk about the recommendations that have been made by some governments, including the British government, about what a reasonable amount of beer consumption would be per day. And the last recommendation from the UK government was that for a man that would be about 2 pints per day, and for a woman it would be 1. It was Thomas Stutterford, who was a medic in the UK, who writes in the London Times, who wrote in 1997 that 90% of men and 80% of women in the United Kingdom enjoy drinking alcohol, and only a tiny fraction drink to excess. Opponents are selective in their reporting. They seize upon disasters which overtake the minority, and they draw conclusions which are applied to the population as a whole. Some while ago, a colleague of mine on the university campus said that he does drink beer, but he never does it in front of the children. I personally found that a frankly bizarre thing to do, because I think if children see adults drinking responsibly and in moderation, it can only send positive signals. It was C.S. Lewis who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, who said that the sun looks down on nothing half so good as a household laughing together over a meal or 2 friends talking over a pint of beer. Klein and Pittman in 1993 said that the emotional state of a person impacts on the beverage of choice. They said that beer drinking increases in response to negative emotions such as loneliness, whereas the intake of wine coolers was increased in association with positive emotional states. And seemingly married people drink more wine when they are sad and bored. I don't necessarily agree with that statement. I never drink wine and my wife is never bored. But the population drinking wine generally tends to be older and possibly wiser than those drinking beer. And perhaps they are less likely to do antisocial things, drinking and driving, for example, for this very reason. Not because of the beverage, but because of the types of people who are drinking it. Berger and Snortum in 1985 suggested the problem is the beer drinking culture. Much beer advertising appealing to gung-ho masculinity. And so male students declaring a preference for beer consider themselves more drunk than those preferring wine. It really is a societal thing. You know, beer drinking is, and the beer market is associated with some formidable degree of advertising, perhaps that you don't see in the world of wine. And many of the advertisements you will see on the television are very humorous, but they do portray people behaving possibly badly sometimes and possibly to excess. And you do have some strange imagery which is not necessarily in keeping with people like me talking about the merits of moderate consumption of beer. The Wall Street Journal, January the 13th, 1988. Drinking tends to be unproblematic when it is a normal, wholesome, enjoyable aspect of everyday life, not an unwholesome, dangerous and mysterious activity to be done in peculiar contexts that are set apart from friends, family and the normal routine of living. Drinking is much like eating. In the salutary view of Italians and many others, a view that contrasts markedly with this special quest for relaxation, relief of psychic stress, delusions of power or escape that prevail in much of Northern Europe and North America. In other words, beer, wine are perfectly normal parts of everyday life, seen on the dinner table, not abused, just accepted as a fundamental of society. And that is the healthiest approach and the healthiest situation. In 13th century Icelandic literature, do not become too fond of the tankard, drink beer with moderation. Or my own personal favourite, which is the Order of Temperance from Germany in 1600, no more than 7 glasses of beer per session and no more than 2 sessions per day. That is a joke. Because we need to avoid binge drinking. Binge drinking, the consumption of 4 for a woman, or more drinks in a row on at least one occasion. And so I urge the students on campus not to be stupid and not to abuse alcohol. There's nothing clever about drunkenness, but there is nothing wrong either with moderate drinking at the right place and at the right time if you're legally allowed to do so. So does beer have a legitimate place in the diet? Back in 2001, Guayar Castillon and his colleagues concluded that the consumption of total alcohol, that is wine and beer, was associated with a lower prevalence of suboptimal health. That's a double negative there. What they're basically saying is moderate consumption actually makes you healthier. Longnecker in 1988 said that hospitalization is less acute for daily moderate drinkers. In other words, your chances of residing in a hospital are less for daily moderate drinkers. And Wiley and Camacho, 1980, showed that moderate alcohol consumption, between 17 and 45 drinks per month, was associated with the most favourable adjusted health scores. And in turn, beer drinkers were shown by Richmond and Warren in 1985 to have significantly lower rates of morbidity, that is, sickness, than expected. 1 drink per day giving 15% less disability than was the case for the general population. How about this? Colonel Worsley, when in India, had a very dangerous attack of dysentery and was given up by the doctors. When dying, as it was thought, he begged the man in a faint whisper to give him some Bass. And as it was thought his case was hopeless, he was humoured. He then drank pint after pint, and began to get better as soon as his yearning was satisfied, much to the astonishment of the doctors and brother officers. And then I've tasted hock and claret too, Madeira and Moselle, but not one of those boshy wines revives this languid swell. Of all complaints from A to Z, the fact is very clear. There's no disease but what's been cured by Bass's bitter beer. Now, I don't think there's anything particularly special about Bass. It's a wonderful product, but I'm sure all beer has the same beneficial effects in moderation. And as we saw in an earlier class for Mackerson Stout, it looks good, it tastes good, and by golly, it does you good. Guinness, of course, was marketed for many years on the concept of Guinness is good for you, Guinness for strength. It's interesting that when I did a recent book called Beer, Health and Nutrition, which some people think is an oxymoron, but I hope you're realizing is not, that the Guinness company were very reluctant to allow me to use this old imagery of their former marketing campaign, such as the sensitivity in this day and age. Compare that to a member of Parliament of the British government who in 1830 said that to the poor, the beer is next to a necessity of life. There is no question that excessive consumption of any alcoholic beverage is disadvantageous. Traffic accidents, falls, drowning, cancers, cirrhosis, pancreatitis, cardiomyopathy, hypertension, fetal alcohol syndrome, the list goes on. But you really do need to abuse it. People talk of cirrhosis of the liver. And 80 grams of alcohol intake daily by a man or 50 grams by a woman gives a 15% chance of liver damage, but the consumption does have to be regular and spread over many years, for example 15 years or more. But abusing alcohol is not clever and is not desirable, whether it's beer, wine or anything else. Let's turn to nutritional value. The Food and Drug Administration classifies a food as a good source of a nutrient if it provides between 10 and 19% of the daily value, the daily requirement for an individual. And an excellent source will provide more than 20% of the daily value. If you look at beer, there are a number of components which actually are at least good sources of some of these nutrients. So beer is not empty calories. Beer does contain calories, and the single major source of calories in any beer is alcohol, in just the same way as those calories are going to come from any other alcoholic beverage. Beer does contain a little bit of protein, but not much. But beer does contain a range of B vitamins. The one that's deficient is thiamine, vitamin B1. And this is because the yeast eliminates it. Even if you add extra thiamine, the yeast will eliminate it. So that's a problem. But some of the other B vitamins are present in significant quantities. Let's take riboflavin, for example. It's present in significant quantities. The daily requirement for riboflavin for a man between the age of 25 and 50 is 1.7 milligrams. Beer contain as much as 0.8. Some beers contain much less, but some contain the significant level. Actually, there's a downside to that, because riboflavin captures the light that will be transferred to the bitter acids when they go skunky. So there's a downside as well. Of the B vitamins, the one that is probably most significant in beer is folate. Beer is a significant source of folate. Beer also contains a range of minerals. There is calcium and phosphorus in beer, magnesium, selenium. And we have recently found that beer is probably the richest source of assimilable silicon in the diet. Studies in Cambridge, England have shown that beer drinkers have a reduced risk of osteoporosis, and this may be one of the reasons why. Beer does contain some soluble fiber. Those cell wall components I talked about, the polysaccharides, are very similar to the ones you find in oats, the ones that are championed in breakfast cereals for your soluble fiber. They cause a problem for beer in that they reduce rates of filtration and wort separation. But if they survive into beer, then it's soluble fiber. And if they're broken down further, they are probably prebiotics, these materials that function as substrates for beneficial bacteria in the large intestine. We are doing more work in this area to see just how beneficial these things really are. People talk about the beer belly. The beer belly is a myth. It's all about the calories in versus calories out. A 12-ounce serving of a beer like Budweiser is about 150 calories. 12-ounce serving of Bud Light is 100 calories. The equivalent alcohol charge from wine, the equivalent single serving of wine, is about 100 calories. They're very similar. If you compare the calorie intake of this 12-ounce serving of Bud with a half a cup of ice cream at 179 calories, or a well-known bar of chocolate at 278 calories, or a donut at 242, or a slice of lemon meringue pie at 375, or a 10 fluid-ounce milkshake at 314, I recommend you take the beer, because then you'll be more health-conscious. It has been shown that really it is a myth. This beer belly is a myth. It's all about the rest of the lifestyle that you have. But this did not stop various well-known diets from coming into the marketplace. And one in particular said that the worst food of all is beer, quote, because beer contains the sugar maltose. And maltose is by far the most fattening of all sugars. And they said the maltose causes a problem with a high glycemic index, and this is the basis of the beer belly. So I wrote to the author of that particular diet, and I pointed out that there is an interesting phenomenon known as fermentation. And in fermentation, the maltose is all converted into alcohol. There is no maltose in most beers. So now they've revamped the diet, and they no longer pick out beer as being a major culprit. But I think the damage was done. And one of the strange things that the brewing industry did was to respond by making so-called low-carb beers. By inference, this means that other beers, by necessity, must be high-carb, and that is not true. Most beers, by any definition of glycemic index you like to consider, are in fact low-carb. But nonetheless, it is a marketing opportunity. Wolfgang Clement, age 64, who was in charge of the German economy and labour ministries, claimed, "I'll down a glass of Kölsch faster than all of you can drink a schnapps," talking to a group of journalists. And he did so in just 1.5 seconds. So here is the man in charge of the German economy and labour ministries quoted as saying people should be able to get prescriptions for beer through the national health system. I don't think I necessarily go quite that far, but it's a far-sighted attitude. Or here, a quote from an article by the Associated Press about the world's oldest person, 114, who enjoyed a very easy life. She enjoyed a beer, and even when she was over 100 years old, the first thing she would ask for is a 7-ounce beer with her food. Just think how old she would have got if she'd had a 12-ounce serving of beer. Beer contains antioxidants. Now, there is a lot said about the antioxidant component of red wine, but beer does contain antioxidants, albeit less than in red wine and certain other things like black tea, green tea, hard cider. The question is, how much of this antioxidant do you actually need? You may have, indeed, too much in some types of beverage. More importantly, the antioxidant levels are usually measured artificially in test tube assays. That's a very different thing from working out how much of these antioxidants actually get into the body. The important thing is they should get into the body. One of the few studies that have been made in this area compared the uptake of an antioxidant from beer and the same antioxidant from the tomato, and it was shown that the uptake of antioxidant from the beer was more efficient. So at least that way, beer is healthier than a tomato. Back in 1926, a man by the name of Raymond Pearl reported a study in which he had interviewed over 2,000 workers in Baltimore. And his conclusions were that moderate drinkers live longer than abstainers, and much longer than those who were heavy drinkers. Now, I was always intrigued by this report because in 1926 was right in the middle of Prohibition, so quite how he did the study, I don't know. Perhaps it was historic data. But this is the first report which has been repeated many times, showing the relationship between the risk of death and alcohol consumption. And these days people talk about U-shaped and J-shaped curves. That if you have no alcohol consumption, your risk of death is greater than if you have moderate consumption, the equivalent of 1 to 2 glasses of beer or wine per day. If you increase the alcohol intake, for some causes of death, the risk increases. This would include accidents and violence, of course. But one factor that remains low as you increase the alcohol intake right the way through 5 or 6 glasses per day, the factor that remains reduced is the risk of coronary heart disease, the risk of atherosclerosis. Because moderate consumption of alcohol cuts down the risk of atherosclerosis, blocking of the arteries, bad cholesterol. Now, this was first highlighted in a program called 60 Minutes a number of years ago, the so-called French paradox. People were talking about the reduced risk of heart disease despite the tendency of people in France to eat a rich diet. And they ascribed the reason for reduced risk as the moderate consumption of red wine. And this was to the considerable benefit of sales of red wine. The claim is that there is a substance present in red wine called resveratrol, which cuts down the risk of the arteries from blocking. Studies have shown that to get enough resveratrol, you have to have many, many bottles of wine every day. The active ingredient is actually the alcohol. And it doesn't matter whether it's red wine, white wine, beer, spirits. In the same equivalent quantity, they will cut down your risk of atherosclerosis. In a famous paper by Rim, Klatsky, Groby, and Stamfer from Harvard, Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Oakland, and the Erasmus University Medical School in Rotterdam, the claim was the evidence suggests that all alcoholic drinks are linked with lower risk of coronary heart disease, so that much of the benefit is from alcohol rather than other components of each type of drink. People say to me, but surely wine drinkers are healthier than beer drinkers. In my more facetious moments I say, well, of course they are, because they eat lettuce leaves, and they exercise, and they are wealthier, and they have better access to health care. Whereas beer drinkers sit in front of the television and watch ball games and eat burgers. There was actually a serious study carried out by some workers in Denmark, and they looked at what people were buying in the supermarket. People were buying wine, I forget the exact ingredients, but things like, I don't know, tofu and spinach and low-fat spreads and diet yogurts and so on. People buying beer were buying red meat and burgers and cigarettes. And if they weren't drinking the beer, they'd be dead by now. So it really is the lifestyle thing. It really is an association that people have with beer and other elements of society and the other aspects of people's life. Would it be that the people who currently drink wine would realize that there's more interest in beer and that the beer has got more nutritional value than the wine, and and is actually at least as good for you. One of the aspects of drinking any alcoholic beverage is it cuts down your risk of ulceration of the stomach, and this is due to the inhibition of an organism called Helicobacter. Beer cuts down the risk of gallstones. Beer cuts down the risk of kidney stones. Beer is said to be associated with improved cognitive function. And the list goes on. So there is an increasing literature to suggest that beer in moderation is actually part of a healthy lifestyle. People claim that the hops in beer have beneficial aspects to them, the polyphenols in the hops. Hops also contain phytoestrogens. Now, as soon as I use the word phytoestrogen, men start to get kind of nervous. The reality is that the phytoestrogens from the hops do not get into the beer in substantial quantities. However, the hop producers are very interested in phytoestrogens, and they are looking for alternative uses for the hops, and it may be that they will find that they can find a market for these exciting molecules for health reasons separate from beer. In fact, the most potent phytoestrogen yet identified is located in hops. Baum-Baker identified 5 benefits on the mind and the intellect associated with moderate drinking. Moderate drinkers are more outgoing and enthusiastic about life. They are less stressed and enjoy all aspects of their life more. They perform some tasks better after a drink. They enjoy fewer incidences of depression, and they fare better when elderly, including better cognitive function. One very sensitive area we need to talk about is cancer. And there is a real range of data out there in the study of the relationship between alcoholic drink consumption and cancer. There are some fairly strong claims that some cancer risks are increased by alcohol consumption. Equally, there are some claims that certain cancers, the risks are reduced by moderate consumption of alcoholic beverages, including beer. And there's some work in Japan which suggests there are some fairly strong anti-carcinogenic materials in beer. It's a very sensitive area, and indeed it's an area that I think is too dangerous emotionally for any brewer to embrace. Years ago, a number of beers in the United States of America were marketed on the basis of good health. Pabst Blue Ribbon was one of them. The Pabst Blue Ribbon is back in vogue these days, but not for that reason. It really does boil down to interpretation and imagery. Recently I published a book called Grape versus Grain, a completely unbiased comparison of wine and beer. And in it I drew attention to the interpretation, the perception of wine and beer. The imagery of wine, the rolling hills around Napa and Sonoma, the beautiful chateau-style architecture, whereas breweries more associated with heavy industry and run-down back streets in big cities. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. As I said earlier in this course, the Sierra Nevada Brewery in Chico is absolutely phenomenally beautiful and must be the most impressive brewery anywhere in the world. But go into your local bookstore and look at the row upon row of quality literature on wine. All of these amazingly glossy books with wonderful pictures and amazing rhetoric all about wine. And what do you find about beer? Not a lot. Most of it is based on humor or whimsy or how to brew it yourself. Really, it's a totally different imagery, and somehow beer therefore has been interpreted as being somehow less complex, less sophisticated. The reality is, as I hope you're realizing from this class, it's more complicated to make than is wine. In my facetious moments I say that all you've got to do to make wine is tread a few grapes and wait. And what do you do while you're waiting? You drink beer. Indeed, there's a saying in the Napa Valley, it takes a lot of good beer to make good wine. And that's because everybody making the wine is busy drinking the beer. And of course, we're seeking for this consistency, this consistent excellence, which is why we control the process and seek consistency from batch to batch. One of the problems that I see is that brewers do not show the degree of fraternity that perhaps they should. What I see in the world of wine is everybody pulling in a common direction, everybody celebrating the wonderful product that it is. But in beer, I see infighting. How unhealthy is it? How inadvisable is it to see large brewing companies advertising on the basis of attacking one another? And how inappropriate it is for smaller brewers to criticize the large brewers for the products that they make. So you see some of the smalling brewing companies being very, very rude about the mainstream North American lagers, not recognizing that those products are made with intense attention to the raw materials and process control. They may not have huge amounts of flavor, but they are excellent beers and should not be criticized, least of all by other brewers. So if only brewers will pull in a common direction and celebrate the wonder that is beer. It is happening. There's a program in North America called Here's to Beer, and similar activities in Europe. And the more we can do to celebrate this wonderful product, the better. Recently, a student of mine, Christine Wright, did a study comparing people's perception of wine and beer. People perceived wine as being healthier. They perceived it as being more complex. But when we were able to tell them about the nutritional value of beer, that its benefits were at least the equal of those of wine, then they would improve the scoring on the beer, or elevate the scoring on the beer. The reality is that the same study showed that the main factor that people look at or consider when they are choosing a beverage is its taste. Above all, the factor was taste, followed by what they were doing, what activity they were undertaking, and where they were, what time of day it was, how much it cost, who they were with, what the company was. And then, next on the list was the food pairing. Then they wanted to know about their after feelings. Then alcohol content came down the list, the serving size, the weather. And it's only then that people said, okay, well, we're influenced by calories, health considerations, and carbs. So really it's about taste and circumstance, the location, and to an extent about food. A lot's been written, still is written about wine and food pairings. The reality is that beer is at least as good a pairing with many types of food. Might I suggest that if you think of most Asian foods, they pair better with beer than they do with wine? Again, jokingly I say, think about great British food, otherwise known as Indian food. Goes far better, in my humble opinion, with beer than it does with wine. Recently I did a beer tasting and a cheese pairing with a colleague of mine, Moshe Rosenberg from UC Davis. And we were able to show tremendous complementarity between a range of cheeses and specific types of beer. We matched with beers like porters and lagers. We matched with Kriek on one occasion. And so there is tremendous opportunity for food pairing complementarity. At the end of the day, though, my recommendation is choose the food you like and the beer you like, and get on with life. So there we have it. Beer is a source of calories. It is a food, after all. But it's not empty calories. There's nothing magical about the calories in beer. Like calories from any other food, too many will make you fat. The same health benefits apply to beer as they do to wine, perhaps even more so. And beer is a fine beverage on the dinner table. It's also a beverage which suits more drinking occasions than wine. Whether you've been indulging in sport, whether you're fishing, whatever you're doing, beer is, in my humble opinion, the beverage of choice. In the next class, we will look at America. We will look at the history of brewing in America, and we will look at the evolution of the craft brewing sector and take a look at two great pioneers of craft brewing in the US.
This ends Lecture 12. The Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 13. Beer in the United States.
Let's take a look at the history of beer and brewing in the United States of America. And let's go back to the Pilgrim Fathers, leaving Southampton, England, September the 6th, 1620, on Mayflower, and disembarking at Plymouth Rock on December the 26th, 1620. Why? Because, quote, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer. They had run out of beer. So the whole history of the United States of America is in this way linked through to beer. So at the appropriate time of the year, when you're celebrating, make sure you have the right beverage in your glass. Actually, they hadn't totally run out of beer. There was enough beer left for the sailors to make sure they had their sustenance as they sailed back to England. And the people landing, the early settlers in those days, would quickly realize that as they drank the local water, they fell sick. Of course, they had no idea about bacteria in those days, but they did feel sick, whereas before, when they drank the ale and the beer, they hadn't been sick. And as we know, during the production of beer, you boil the wort. This kills off microorganisms. And of course, in hoppy beer, you have the antimicrobial bitter acids. So ale and beer, safer to drink than water. The early settlers realized that one of the first things they needed to do was build a brewery. And in every new American settlement, the first building constructed was the brewery. And they built the taverns, the center of the community. Apart from drinking beer there, this would also be where they would have meetings, where they would make decisions. So much went on in the tavern. It was the center of the community. One of the problems for the early settlers was a shortage of barley and a shortage of hops. And unless they had shipments coming in on board ship, then they would have to make advantage and take advantage of local materials. And so the saying was, if barley be wanting to make into malt, we must be content and think it no fault, for we can make liquor to sweeten our lips of pumpkins and parsnips and walnut tree chips. It wouldn't be my personal preference to have beer made out of those materials. Equally, I'm not quite sure what it would taste like to replace the hops with spruce, which is what they did. But it's ingenious, and there was a desire to have a beer or an alcoholic drink of some description. It was Adrian Block, a Dutchman, who opened the first brewery in North America in 1613. In a log hut in New Amsterdam, which would of course become New York City. The first public brewery was opened by the Dutch West India Company in Lower Manhattan in 1632. Interestingly, the grist was not barley malt, but it was largely of oats. Beer was considered, as it still should be, a drink of moderation, and certainly preferable to some of the more dubious alternatives then available. As immigration continued and people were interested in stronger beverages, distilled beverages, there were some interesting, I'm sure, but fairly dubious distillates of fermented corn. John Harvard, who of course lent his name to a famous university,